Hi there. Welcome back to Green TV, Meet the Solutionaries. And I am very pleased to welcome back to the program or the platform or the series, friend of the climate, friend of mine, Dan Miller. He is about the most knowledgeable person other than being a scientist or a Sheldon White House politician. Maybe you're up there too, right there with him. But someone who can distill it down and translate into English, the nuts and bolts, the technical stuff, the venture capital parts, the money, the technology, the urgency, and really the optimism and the pessimism. I really like how you straddle that that line, that fence between hope and despair in every clubhouse room you do. So thanks for joining us, Dan, to talk about IRA, which just always doesn't sound right because it sounds like, individual retirement account. But it also is not exactly just inflation. IRA.
Well, Inflation Reduction Act, but I think we can just call it the climate bill because we'll be talking more about the climate provisions. There's medical, there's, prescription drugs and other things in it.
Right.
They threw everything into this one thing to get it passed. But I think today we'll be talking about the climate provision. So people call it the climate bill.
Right. That's what I was trying to get to. I messed up the acronym for IRA, but the point is that it is the climate bill. It is not the best climate legislation we could have gotten, but it's what we got, and it's better than nothing. So let me hear your assessment of.
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say it's a great climate bill. Okay, I don't want we were talking previously, and as I said, it's they did what they could, not what they should. I mean, there should be. Climate's a very serious problem, and people are starting to understand that by starting to see the impacts that we're facing, and those impacts are going to increase over time. And so we should really be doing everything we can to prevent those impacts from getting much worse. But given all of that, and given the political realities, there's a lot in this bill that will be very, very helpful. And we can talk a little bit about what's missing from the bill that really should be in a future bill. But currently what's in the bill, you can kind of summarize it as saying it's subsidizing renewable energy and electrification and things like that hopefully reduce fossil fuels, but we'll talk about that a little bit. And there's also one part that will definitely reduce fossil fuel emissions, and that is increased incentives for carbon capture. And in fact, maybe if we just jump right into that part.
And before we do, let me officially introduce you. I know you so well, and so that you are the managing director of the Roda Group, which is sort of intersection of clean technology and venture capital, and that's why you are so good at, like I said, translating where these two meet and what's happening.
Actually, the story on that is that it started the Roda Group in 1997, and it wasn't a clean tech venture capital. We did Ask Jeeves, people might remember that one, but we did enterprise software and the internet and things like that. But starting in the 1990s, I started reading about climate change, and I started talking to climate scientists, and then really got more and more involved in really trying to understand what was going on. So in 2005, we switched what we were doing from sort of call it regular venture capital into clean tech venture capital, and all our new investments starting in 2005 were in the clean tech space. And so now we sold off the legacy companies long ago, and so now our portfolio is all clean tech, including things like carbon capture, I should say, because I'll be talking about that, which we invested in 10 years ago when no one was interested in carbon capture at all, and for a reason that this bill addresses, and that was there was no business model to make any money in carbon capture because no one would pay you to clean up something that was free to dispose of in the air, right? So that's what carbon capture is.
Nor was the technology really there, was it, 10 years ago for carbon capture?
Well, actually, the technology, that's kind of a myth. The technology's been around for about 50 years. Carbon capture is used in industrial processes, and it wasn't used at huge scale, but it was used inside of actually oil refineries is a place where it's used a lot. And so but the technology never advanced very much, I think it's safe to say, because there was no reason to do it. No one would pay you to do carbon capture, so why would anyone bother, except for these, smaller scale industrial kinds of things. But the basic technology was actually there. And I should say there's two kinds of carbon capture, and the climate bill actually incentivizes both of these. So one is called, generally called carbon capture and sequestration, or carbon capture and storage, CCS. Usually when you say CCS, what you mean is a carbon capture system attached to some kind of industrial plant, or a point source of CO2 coming out of a smokestack, for example. And that would be, for example, a cement plant's a great example, because a typical cement plant puts out 1 million to 1.5 million tons of CO2 per year. That is a lot of CO2. That's a single plant.
And we have not come up with a good cement substitute yet. There's really nothing.
That's right. And there's actually an interesting reason why that is. And that is that fossil fuels are really good at generating heat. They don't generate electricity. They generate heat. So what we do is we use their heat to boil water, to make steam, to push a turbine to turn it to make electrons. So it's kind of like this little Rube Goldberg thing to make electrons. But wind and solar, they make electrons right out, they just come out right out of the wind or the solar.
With no
so they're more efficient and therefore, and actually cheaper today to make electrons using renewables than with coal or natural gas. But when you look at things like cement, where you're trying to get process heat, like really 1,500 degrees, kind of heat, very high levels, then it turns out that fossil fuels are way cheaper, like maybe 1/5 the cost, although the fossil fuel cost is up a little bit, so maybe it's not quite as dramatic difference, but 2 to 5 times more expensive to take electrons, turn them into heat for something like cement. It'd be very expensive. So that's one reason why it's quite easy, and we should, as quickly as we can, replace all electricity production with renewables. Yes, there's the problem of nighttime and when the wind isn't blowing, but it turns out that there's lots of ways to balance the grid. There's lots of ways. Energy storage is getting cheaper all the time, and things like that, that we could actually do that or get way, way, way high in terms of percentage of renewables. Quite straightforward. The industrial sector, people are working on green cement, people are working on green steel. All of these have maybe demonstrations going, but you got to remember, even once you commercialize the thing, you then have to go around the world and replace every cement plant, every steel mill. I mean, first of all, the carbon footprint of that is huge, right? So having a way to capture 95% of the CO2 coming out of the smokestack and putting it back underground or turning it into rock is a really good thing. Okay, someday we're going to have green cement and we can turn those things off. That'll be great. But that's going to be decades from now. And we don't want to emit 1.5 million tons of CO2, which, by the way, cement alone is about 8% of all the emissions of the world. And only half of it, comes from the burning of fossil fuels. The other half comes from the chemical reaction of the cement when you make it, which gives off CO2. So
double jeopardy.
So even if you got rid of fossil fuels and used electricity, you still would have half the emissions from cement. It's a really tough problem. So carbon capture, and especially the next generation, the older ones we talked about, used in the last 50 years, are based on a sort of a liquid chemical called amine, and you pass the flue gas through it, bubble it through, and the CO2 sticks into the fluid, and then you have to regenerate the fluid. It's complicated, it's expensive, it's a toxic fluid, and all this kind of stuff. There's the next generation just coming online now, and this is part of what we invested in, by the way, is using solid sorbents. Think of them as, they kind of look like air filters, and you just pass the flue gas through it, and the CO2 sticks to the walls, and then after it gets saturated, so it's filled with CO2, you pass heat through it, some waste heat or steam, low-grade steam, not like we're talking about for cement. So things that can actually eventually be generated with electricity in a cost-effective way using heat pumps and things like that. And then the CO2 gets out, and then you're ready to go again. And this whole cycle takes 1 minute, by the way, from capture to release to capture again. So that is something that is now doable for a lot of these industrial things. Now that is CCS. That's the point source. There's a whole other kind of carbon capture, which is very often called direct air capture, which are sort of the technology is almost identical in the basics of it, but instead of capturing CO2 from a power plant where the concentration of CO2 coming up the smokestack is like 5 to 20% of all of the gas in that, in that smokestack. In the air, CO2 is only 0.04% of the atmosphere. You're going, what?
Where does it go?
Yeah. Wait, how could that be? Why do we have climate change? Well, the reason we have climate change is because it used to be 0.03%. And now it's 0.04%. And actually, it's increased 50%. We've increased the CO2 content of the atmosphere from 280 parts per million, which is 0.028, or around 0.3, up to 420 parts per million, or 0.04% of the atmosphere. And that little bit is what keeps the world a nice, comfortable thing. It was before, and now this little extra bit is warming it up a lot. But the point is, in the air, it's such a low concentration that it's a harder job to get it out of the atmosphere, and therefore it costs more money. You basically have to leave these filters, you have to pass a lot of air through them to capture a lot of the CO2 to saturate them so that you can recycle and regenerate the filter. So the new climate bill, getting back to that, so I should say that up until about a few years ago, the only incentive for carbon capture, remember, the reason we have climate change is because there is an official policy of the world. It's not written down anywhere, but it's the official policy of the world that you're allowed to pollute the atmosphere with greenhouse gases for free. It's
or
a
as Al Gore would say,
to have.
the atmosphere is an open sewer.
The atmosphere is an open sewer. I'm not allowed to throw my garbage in your yard, but we all are allowed to dump our CO2 into the atmosphere.
And the ocean.
That's right. And well, it gets into the ocean actually, but through the atmosphere, and it acidifies the ocean. And that's a whole interesting set of things right there. But getting back to this, so up until recently, there was no reason to do carbon capture. There was no economic reason except for one, and that is the oil industry buys CO2 because when they inject it into an oil well that's kind of depleted, but there's still something left, the CO2 acts as a solvent for the oil and helps you get more oil out of the ground. So the funny thing is that the reason that in the past that you would do carbon capture, the only way you could make any money whatsoever, because soda pop, there's only a few uses of CO2. Oil, which is by far the biggest in terms of money. There's Coca-Cola and things like that. Turns out that's food grade CO2, and it's hard to, you can't really get it out of a coal plant. You have to clean it up. It costs too much. And then there's greenhouses, and it's it's not a zero market, but not a very big market. So EOR was the only way to get paid to do carbon capture. And so everyone says, all the carbon capture demonstrations we did in the past, they failed. Well, they failed because the price of oil dropped, and therefore you could get very little for the CO2, and that was the only way you were getting paid. And so it was kind of funny that people complain, they think it's the technology that failed. The technology was fine. For the most part, there's been it's a new, as they scale up, there's some failures, of course. If you don't have failures, you're probably not being aggressive enough. But the real reason it failed, there weren't incentives. Then, believe it or not, the person who signed the first incentive in the United States for carbon capture was Donald Trump. And it was a provision called 45Q, which paid like $50, $30 to $50 for carbon capture. And which was good because some of the CCS systems cost about $50 a ton. By the way, this is per ton of CO2 captured, I should say, very important. So $50 a ton is about right. But when you take into account the moving the CO2 to an injection well and compressing it and sticking it back underground where it came from, and not using it for EOR, but just getting rid of it, that adds another $20, $30. And so you're talking about maybe $80. And so it was a good incentive, but it also had many restrictions. You had to build your plant by 2025, and people were rushing to get things going, but incentives weren't really there. And there weren't really incentives for capturing it out of the air at that point. So now the new bill comes along, and they've enhanced these 45Q provisions. And so now it's, I believe it's $85 a ton for CCS, and I think up to $180 a ton for direct air capture. A lot of issues along the when you get started. They've extended the time to, I think it's 2033 to get started on your project, which is really good. That means you're going to get a lot more projects. There used to be a minimum amount of CO2 you had to capture, which was rather quite large, which meant you had to do like cement plants and things like that. And now they've lowered it so you can include a lot of other projects into this. So it's really opened the door, and now it's going to really pay for it. So now there's economic incentive, even for polluters like a cement plant. It's just, for them, it's only a cost, right? They're still allowed to pollute the atmosphere for free. We have to get to that. That's something we should change. That should be the next climate bill should change that.
Climate bill.
But this
How
is
long
going
would
to
it
give
take to get to this one? But things are
going to give incentive for these polluting plants to get rid of their CO2. I should say, by the way, and I agree with this. There's been, quote, criticism, you can call it, that, hey, this is going to let fossil fuel companies continue to use fossil fuels, and that's bad. Well, first of all, for electricity production, as I explained already, it's already cheaper without carbon capture to make electricity using wind and solar, right? So there is no reason in the world to slap a carbon capture system onto a coal plant or a natural gas power plant, because it's just, you should, if you have one of those plants, you should shut them down and buy wind and solar right now with some storage and upgrade your grid, and you'll be in better shape than you were before. And you won't be impacted by the geopolitical factors of what Mr. Putin does, and so you'll be in much better shape anyway.
Well, we all but the fossil fuel companies won't be financially, and so isn't that the roadblock, or it has been so much?
Well, obviously fossil fuel companies are trying to stop climate action to the extent that they can and whatever, and I think that's short-sighted of them. I mean, some of them, and by the way, they're also doing good things. They all of them together have put together a big climate fund that's actually doing real climate technology development, similar, like a big version of what we do at the Roda Group. And they have a lot of money, so they pump billions of dollars into that. So there's that kind of thing happening. They do want to figure out what's our next business model. Where can we get to? And remember, it's not just them. We're all driving cars. We're all making cement. We're all doing all these things that require fossil fuels. And so I do think that there should be climate policy that reduces that demand. So right now we've been promoting renewables, which we think gets rid of fossil fuels. But so far, if you look at the global view, all of the renewables that we've made so far have only gone to supply new energy demand. They haven't reduced fossil fuel consumption yet. Fossil fuels is not growing like it used to grow, and maybe it's leveled off, I guess, depending on how you look at it. But it's not dropping. We need it to drop dramatically. And so that's, again, talking about the next climate bill, we should also focus on reducing demand for fossil fuels by putting a price on carbon, for example, something obviously missing from this climate bill. And that's because people don't like taxes. But as you know, talking to me in the past, there's a way to put a price on carbon that almost everybody would like. You put a rising price, it goes up every year. It increases the cost of fossil fuels and everything made from fossil fuels, which people wouldn't like that. But then you take 100% of the money collected and give it back to every legal resident on an equal basis. And it turns out that since wealthy people use far more CO2 than the average person, and governments use a lot of CO2 and they don't get a dividend, that the bottom 70% of households will make more money on what they get paid every month from the dividend than they pay in higher prices due to the fee. That's called fee and dividend, carbon fee and dividend.
Exactly, which made so much sense. Of course, it didn't get very far. It's too logical.
Well, it's still there. It's still in Congress.
Is
a
it?
group called Citizens Climate Lobby promotes the fee and dividend carbon policy.
I was there when Marshall Saunders was trying to decide if he should start CCL at Al Gore's training. We were waiting for a cab on the curb in Nashville. And he said, I got this idea, and it's kind of based on something else I did previously. What do you think, Betsy? And I said, do it, go for it. So when I get a lot of guests who say, hey, there's something called the Citizens Climate Lobby. I said, I know.
Yeah, that's a great thing.
Yeah.
If people want to get engaged on climate policy, which I recommend everybody do, it's a great way to go, is Citizens Climate Lobby. citizensclimatelobby.org.
And you go lobby representatives on both sides of the aisle. That was at least a big.
Yeah, they meet with every congressional office, both sides of the aisle. They're bipartisan. And by the way, the thing I just described to you is a bipartisan approach to carbon pricing. I spoke to George Shultz when he was still alive at a climate conference, and I mentioned fee and dividend. He said, "Well, I came up with that, you know." So, it's definitely a Republican plan if you really look at its elements, because it doesn't grow government at all. The government doesn't keep a penny, right? It uses market forces to correct a problem, and it doesn't pick winners or losers.
Right, but it's seen as a carbon tax, and that's like anathema, like gas tax is. It just makes certain people in certain parties just go, can't have a tax, even if it makes so much sense and is so needed.
It's really not you can argue whether it's a tax or not. It's called fee and dividend, because the government doesn't keep any of the money, so it doesn't go to the government.
It gets shorthanded as a tax, and that's why it takes time to discuss these things, and that's why we have these discussions here. But
in terms of picking winners and losers, the climate bill is certainly picking winners or losers, providing subsidies for electric vehicles and for heat pumps and wind and solar tax credits and all these kinds of things. And these are good things, you know, and probably you're going to have a much bigger impact than you think at first, because by promoting, let's say, heat pumps, just as one example, they're kind of more expensive now than just a natural gas boiler for your house, even though they're going to save you money over time because they cost less to operate. And they have the other advantage of using electricity instead of natural gas. And as we clean up our electric grid, we're going to have a cleaner and cleaner electric grid, and that means your home will be cleaner and cleaner from a greenhouse gas point of view. But as we make more, so this is going to increase demand by subsidizing heat pumps. It's going to increase demand quite a bit for heat pumps. And therefore, manufacturers are going to figure out ways to make more of them, and the price is going to come down. And then when these subsidies expire, the price of heat pumps will still be quite low. This happened with solar panels, by the way, which have dropped in price by something like 99% in 30 years. It's incredible how much they've decreased in price. It's only really in the last 5 years that wind and solar has been cheaper than fossil fuels for electricity production. It's just amazing, by the way. And the cool thing is they're going to keep dropping for the next 10 years. And 10 years from now, we will be able to do, for example, overbuild wind and solar, build maybe 4 times more than you need on a sunny day, just so you have enough on a cloudy day. And then on a sunny day, you'll have excess energy, which you can use for like desalinization, decarbonization, like carbon capture, maybe making hydrogen, so you can use it for industrial processes. So the world's going to look very different in the future because renewable energy is so cheap today and is getting cheaper and cheaper every day. And EVs, for example, the price of batteries.
That's going to come down. And what did
it already came down? Battery costs have already come down about 90% in the last 10 years. Imagine if that happens again. Your EV is going to be cheaper than your fossil fuel car. And just starting now, actually, if you get a Bolt, it's only $25,000, so it's pretty cheap.
So what did the climate bill do to the proliferation of EVs? I mean, is this going to be a giant shot in the EV arm, or a little one because it was kind of going in the right direction finally already? How big a deal is this to the, the adaptation of electric vehicles, really starting to replace ICE, internal combustion engine?
ICE is internal combustion engine cars, so we'll call those ICE cars. Well, first of all, there already was
add to heating. Sorry, go ahead.
Again?
There's nothing cool about ICE cars because
nothing cool about ICE cars, right? So there was incentives before of $7,500, but they were capped per manufacturer at 200,000 vehicles. So Tesla, long ago, I have an old Tesla, so I got that, but no new Teslas get that, and all GM has sold out of the 200,000. So they weren't incentivized anymore, and some of the smaller manufacturers still were. So now it's changing. Now Tesla and GM come back, and everyone gets the credit except there's a bunch of restrictions. First one is on your income. People complain that why are you giving millionaires tax breaks? Okay, so now as an individual, your adjusted gross income has to be $150,000 or less, or a couple $300,000 or less. That's number one. Number two, the price of the car. Like, why are you giving discounts to $100,000 cars? And that was another complaint. So now the rebate only applies to cars, regular cars under $55,000, or pickup vans and SUVs under $80,000. And they also don't want to subsidize cars made in China and everywhere else. So now it only applies to cars assembled in the United States with batteries assembled in the United States. And there's some phase-in issues there. So they're based on the year, it varies a little bit, but that's basically it. And so not all cars qualify. Teslas, many of them are over $55,000, but I think the Model Y, which I guess is classed as an SUV, is typically under 80. So that one probably would qualify. You have to watch out where the batteries come from. Some batteries come from China. And what you're going to see, since this is an incentive, you are going to see Chinese manufacturers assemble cars in the United States with batteries that are assembled in the United States. And you're going to see Europeans are doing that already. So BMW has plants in the United States and Volkswagen. So you'll see that happen. And of course, Japan does as well. So you're going to see that. And at first, there'll be fewer cars than you think qualify because of this, how much they cost, and also where they're made. But first of all, EV prices are generally coming down. They went up recently because of all the inflation and things, but they'll get back down on that track. This is going to help. And if your state like California has $2,500, you're talking about getting a Chevy Bolt for $15,000. That's incredible, right?
Nothing prohibitive. Nothing prohibitive there. Speaking of prohibitive, Joe Manchin, we have to talk about the Manchin factor. In the end, how detrimental are the concessions that had to be made, to allow him to be not the worst person on the planet?
Right. I should point out that every single Republican voted against the climate bill. So it was.
Yeah, I know. Thank you.
50 others.
Thank you. I do want to talk about that before we close, because that
50 others that represent 20% of the
planet is burning, as it's never been more apparent, painfully apparent. Every day there's something dreadful, people dying. And it's like, what about that makes these people sit high on their horse, think they can get away with that, and will be supported at the polls? If they are supported at the polls for that kind of climate behavior alone, I don't know about you, but I think I may just hang it up. Like, it's just insane.
Well, actually, I don't know if this is true. I just read this somewhere, and then we can see if it ends up being true, that not this 2024 election, but the 2028 election, they were predicting will be the first true climate election, where if you are not totally on board with climate action, you wouldn't have a chance of winning.
Can't wait till that.
Just imagine the climate impacts we're going to see between now and then, and that could be true.
No, it needs to be 2024, if not the midterms. I mean, look,
we hope, but
yeah, that the climate is collapsing. So Joe Manchin, just a couple of thoughts on him. And I know
what I've read, and I haven't checked this myself.
Good, but we got good. We didn't get perfect, but some people say it was a poison pill that we, should not have swallowed. Others, I would say no. It's better than nothing. A lot better than nothing.
Yeah. I've heard that the ratio of the increased emissions from the Manchin provisions is like 1/40th of the positive emissions reduction provisions in the rest of the bill. And I think that's probably, maybe it's 20-1 instead of 40-1, who knows, but it's a significant amount. And you got to remember that the rules he's talking about, it just made it easier to lease on government land, and it's a very small percentage of those leases that are offered are ever taken up. A lot of the oil production is on private land. And so we're not even, it's really, we mentioned we have to get to the point where we're reducing fossil fuel demand and get rid of all that stuff that comes next. In fact, that's what we really have to do next. Is you have to distinguish between, so the reason we have climate change is because we burn fossil fuels. Renewable energy doesn't cause climate change. That's great. It also doesn't get rid of climate change. It only gets rid of climate change to the extent it gets rid of fossil fuels. So the smart thing to do is, rather than, try to build up this other thing and hope it gets rid of this thing, hey, focus on the bad thing, put a price on carbon, give all the money back to the public so they support a very high fee. And it's a high fee that will drive the reduction in fossil fuel use. Another thing you can do, and we're starting to do this even in California and some European countries, is you just ban the sale of ICE cars starting in 2035. I would recommend 2030, but California and other countries have said, hey, we're going to ban it. So that's one way to get rid of fossil fuels. Is it's just like, we didn't put a price on asbestos. We just banned asbestos when we found out it was bad. Now, granted, fossil fuels are in every part of our life, and so you can't just get rid of them tomorrow, but you can have a plan to phase them out. And when you have that plan in place, people will recognize that plan and will start building up renewables and other energy efficiency and all these other things that will fill in the gaps. And it will be great for the economy, right? It'll create, for every dollar invested in fossil fuels, and if you invest $1 in renewables, you get 3 times as many jobs. Because you think about it, fossil fuels not really a labor-intensive kind of thing, but putting up solar panels and wind and doing all of those things, it's a very labor-intensive.
Yeah, I was going to say,
create lots of jobs, and will help the economy because we'll be doing a lot of cool new things. You got to watch out because helping the economy also creates emissions. But I think it's better if we decarbonize our economy, then we can actually have a thriving economy without causing damage, as much damage. By the way, just consuming stuff separate from climate change. We have microplastics in the ocean and things like that. There's a lot of planetary problems that we have before us, and we have to address all of them. But I do think
why we talk about
focus on
green TV.
Climate change.
All shades of green, A through Z. That's what I've always done with my green reporting, because it is all connected. And climate, of course, is the mother of all of them, making everything get exacerbated. But it's not the only. And then there's a lot of great climate podcasts out there, a little plug for green TV, but none of them really look at the whole big picture, which one can do only if one has immersed herself in this green soup for 25 years. So just want to get that little plug in for anybody who's wondering, why should I watch green TV when I can, whatever? That's what I pride myself on, because there's so many solutionaries out there, starting with the climate hawks like yourself. But there's just so many other issues, which we will get to, and we are getting to. But this climate bill, just to kind of wrap it up, because you and I could clearly go on all day, all night, as we do sometimes in your clubhouse rooms. I want to mention Kyrsten Sinema, even though you rightfully pointed out the 50 Republicans. I don't know what I don't know how much carbon they're inhaling or what they're on or what planet they have reservations on. But, she's an odd duck because, she's certainly no climate champion, as evidenced, many occasions and examples. But yet her state, Arizona, is suffering through, one of the worst droughts we're seeing. And we're seeing droughts on the East Coast now, too. So that says, of course, Arizona is in drought. And so her concession was she got money to ameliorate the drought, or drought reparations or whatever that even looks like, but she doesn't really believe in climate change. Just talk about cognitive dissonance, talk about climate dissonance.
I'm not sure she would say she doesn't believe in climate change. I don't think.
Oh, okay, maybe believe is
put it that way. But the other thing she did, by the way, the real thing she got out of it was she reduced the tax on investment tax credit. No, not the investment tax. It's carried interest provisions. By the way, it's what venture capitalists make money on. So. She's helping me, but I don't want that. I think it's it's just wrong. And she has a lot of wealthy donors, and they said, hey, you get to make one change. Okay, yeah, get something for Arizona, make it look like you're doing that. But really what happened is she had them remove, it's not the climate part of the bill, it's the tax part of the bill, where they removed this increased tax on people who make money from investments, basically. Is a simple way of putting it. Yeah. And so that's what she got out of it. She came around. I mean, we didn't know, right, until the very end, if Manchin or Sinema were going to come around. Are you surprised, just time to take a bigger picture view, that Manchin did what he did in the end? Well, it's that people accused the Democrats of actually playing politics here. I know you can start with that.
Go ahead. Are you surprised that Manchin in the end did what he did? Was some kind of jujitsu move? I don't know what we even call it.
Right. Well, it's interesting. What I've heard is that they wanted to pass the CHIPS bill, which was the sort of domestic integrated circuit production bill, but the Republicans didn't want the climate bill to pass, or the IRA bill to pass. So they said, even though they supported the CHIPS bill up until that point, they said, if you pass the climate bill, then we're not going to pass the CHIPS bill. And then what happened? Manchin came out and said, there's inflation. I'm definitely not going to pass this climate bill. Forget it. And everyone was shocked, and he got all this crap thrown at him for doing that. And then, since there was no climate bill on the table, the Republicans did help pass the CHIPS bill, which I guess needed 60 votes. And so they passed it. And only hours after they passed it, they announced that Manchin and Schumer came to an agreement. So it obviously was that this was a little plan up their sleeve to get everything done. And it's great. And and because the Republicans were angry that they were
angry that they're
outsmarted,
that
they blocked passage of the veterans bill that helped health benefits for veterans, which made them look really bad. And then they passed it a few days later because they were just getting so much crap for that. So a little politics happening here, but remember, keep our eye on the prize.
Yeah,
this bill is great. We should all be happy that the Congress has finally done something in this area. For a long, long time, did very, very little, but it's not even close to enough. It's in the right direction. We have steps in the right direction. We have to put a price on carbon. We have to do things to phase out fossil fuels. We have to do things, by the way, to start adapting to the climate, this new climate that we're in, that's going to keep changing. There's a lot of work to do, but I think we all can be happy and proud that this bill passed, and think of it as a step forward, and let's keep moving forward.
And it renewed my faith and pride in the Democratic Party, because as I was going to say a moment ago, it's almost like they took, a play from the Republican rule book by being strategic and kind of brilliant, and kind of sneaky in a good way for the greater good, right? It's like, whoa, you guys can do this when you really need to, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, that sounds like a good thing, and it probably is. Did that fool enough Republicans that they said, okay, we'll swallow the climate bitter pill, even though they've got to live on Earth too, as do their children and grandchildren?
Yeah, it's kind of wonder about what's going on in their heads sometimes, because most of them, there's a few that really don't get it and don't understand, but vast majority know what's going on. And again, their states are getting walloped by it. It's not even, that's a big change, by the way, is that only in the last 5 years, last few years, have even the media really called climate change for things that are clearly due to climate change. And it's not going to stop, by the way. It's only going to get worse. That will help give us more political action, I guess. It would be a hell of a lot better if we could get the action without waiting for the disasters, but
the disasters are coming.
The way we work right now.
So. I think it's going to be impossible to ignore climate change. That's the good news about the bad news. The bad news being the extreme weather is just a daily occurrence somewhere in the world. And, the last whimper of the dinosaurs has been heard, let's hope. And thank you, Dan, for your time and your expertise. I was going to say a couple of things, but I forgot what they were. It's always, you have a lot to say.
Thanks for having me on, and enjoyed talking.
You're the expert, so better that the audience hears what you have to say. And where we go from here. Thanks for touching on that. And we will, of course, be in touch, because this is just the beginning, not the end. Hopefully not the beginning of the end. The end of the beginning, the end of the crazy part, let's hope.
Okay, very good.
Thanks,
take care.
Okay. Bye-bye. Bye. We want to invite everybody to go to greentv.com and subscribe. The more subscribers we get, the sooner we can go live and expand our coverage and become 24/7, because what is more important than talking about how we're going to save ourselves? Not the planet. The planet will be fine. It's us. We need Mother Nature more than she needs us. If you need explanation on that, stay tuned to Green TV. Thanks.
I wanted to see the Mustang.
Okay, yeah.
This is gorgeous.
Thanks.
I didn't realize Mustang was making them.
Yeah. They only made, I think, 21,000 last year.
Yeah.
Because they started production.